Okay, we are on page 77. Okay, and we're going to start with our Old Testament women of power, and we call them submissive women in authority on page 77. In the Bible, there are several women who exhibited an amazing amount of authority. However, within its pages, the Bible doesn't present any woman with godly authority who was not under authority. In the Old Testament, there were three women named as prophetesses with the same power to speak for God as did the most renowned masculine prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah. The first mentioned was Miriam, the sister of Moses. I don't know if you realize this, but Miriam's the Hebrew pronunciation or the Hebrew word for Mary in the New Testament. And that's why there were so many Marys in the New Testament, because these Hebrew women wanted to, you know how you name your child after somebody you want them to emulate? They saw Miriam as this woman of God, so they named a lot of their daughters Marys, because there were so many Marys in the New Testament. Okay. Miriam, the sister of Moses. He was her younger brother, and she boldly saved Moses when the Pharaoh declared the death of all Hebrew baby boys. We are all familiar with the account of Moses leading the Hebrews out of the slavery of Egypt into the promised land under the authority of her younger brother. In her role of prophetess, she led the women in songs of praise to God. She was also mentioned with profound respect by the prophet Micah as he spoke for God in Micah 6:4. And this is God, Jehovah God speaking. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. God himself recognized Miriam as a leader of the children of Israel. Now, let me just go over a little bit about Miriam's life. Marker in here. Now we know that she was Moses's older sister. Her parents, Jochebed and Ammon, had three children. First, they had Miriam, then they had Aaron, and then 3 years later, they had Moses, and Moses was the baby in the family. Now, at that time, if you remember the story, the children of Israel were multiplying in the land. And the leadership of Egypt were afraid of their great numbers, that they could rebel and maybe form an army and protest and try to get their freedom. So the Pharaoh made a declaration that all the young boy babies that were born were to be slaughtered. So that would halt some of the threat to Egypt with this great Israelite army, actually, that was growing. Now, Miriam joined with her mother, Jochebed, and they made a little basket. They made it out of reeds, and they lined it, and they put pitch or tar on it so it wouldn't sink and it could float on the water. And they said that Moses was a beautiful baby. So they put the baby, Moses, at 3 months old, in this basket, and they put it in the reeds by the Nile River. Now, Miriam, she was the older sister. We don't know how much older she was, but she was a young girl. She was no threat to anyone. She was watching the baby in the basket, and I could just see the high reeds and her like looking and making sure he's okay. And as she was watching him, she saw the princess of Egypt. She was showering, she was bathing in the Nile with her female servants were there. And they went to look and see what was in the basket. And when she opened the basket, Moses began to cry. And her motherly heart went out to this baby. And she said, he's surely a Hebrew child that someone was trying to protect from the edict of the Pharaoh. So she says, I'm going to keep him. And that's when Miriam parted the reeds again and said, what if I find for you a Hebrew woman to nurse him for you? And she said, go find one. So she brought her mother Jochebed to the princess of Egypt. And she got to nurse her child probably between the ages of up to 2 to 4 was like the latest anyone in those days would nurse a child. So maybe 3 years old. So for 3 years, Miriam was a big part of Moses's life because of her mother nursing her brother. Now, after that, Moses was taken into the palace and he was trained in all the wisdom and knowledge of Egypt. And Miriam, I'm sure, watched from a distance, listened around the court to see what was going on with her brother. And he was there for 40 years, or really 37 after he was weaned in the palace. And then one day he's out, looking around, and an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew slave. And it seems that he knew he was a slave because he defended this slave. And what he did was kill the Egyptian. And he buried him in the sand, and he thought he got away with it. But the next day he was out and about, and 2 Hebrews were fighting. And he tried to break them up. And one of them said, what are you going to do? You're going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? And he realized that it was known that his secret was exposed. And he was afraid. He was afraid that the Pharaoh would, because he killed an Egyptian, would hold that against him. And it might have meant his death. So he decides to run away. So that was the last that Miriam saw her brother for 40 years, because he went to the land of Midian. And there he met Zipporah, and he lived in her house and had 2 children. So for 40 years, Miriam has no idea if he's living or dead. And I always said that she had this big sister syndrome. There's something about being an older sister with a younger brother. You're kind of like the second place mom. I think because moms usually say, will you watch him for me? I have to do this. Will you watch him? So that so Miriam had this sense of responsibility for her brother. And all of a sudden, after 40 years of no sight or sound and any idea what was happening, he appears on the scene again. And news traveled fast. Before there was no newspapers. People, through word of mouth, when something happened, it would just be broadcasted everywhere. This is why when Jesus spoke, there'd be 5,000 people would show up, because everybody talked. And one person told another person, and they were actually very good and accurate in their news reporting. Some people think that the Bible was written so long ago that it was like that telephone game. One person says something, and by the time you get to the end, the message is completely different. But because there wasn't any written documentation, people learned to really listen to what was said and memorize it and know it accurately. That's the reason why we have a lot of the Old Testament stories written by Moses. They were passed from one generation to the next, and the Holy Spirit's inspiration was on it too. So, but anyways, back to Moses and Miriam. Now, Miriam, when Moses, I just could imagine her joy. Here she is, here's her little brother. He's a grown man, actually 80 years old. And she's probably about 70, 80. No, she's about 87. I mean, their lifespans were still long at that time. Average lifespan was like 130 years old, like double almost what ours is today. So So here's her brother on the scene again. And not only that, he goes to the Pharaoh. He asks for freedom for the Jewish people. He performs all these miracles. And I could just see her heart bursting with pride for her little brother. And Aaron, who was a little bit older than Moses, 7 years actually, was at his side. And her two brothers were going to lead the children of Israel from the bondage of Egypt to the promised land. So she was really excited. And after they crossed the Red Sea, there's a portion in Exodus 15, the beginning. It's called the Song of Moses. And in that song, it talks about the sea parting and the Egyptians drowning. And then Moses saw this beautiful deliverance from Egypt as a sign of absolute assurance that they would enter the promised land. And he mentions that in his song of the assurance of we're leaving Egypt, but we're going to Canaan. And those people are going to be defeated too. Well, when they left the promised land, after the parting of the Red Sea, it says that Miriam led the women in songs. It's in Exodus 15, 20 and 21. It says, Miriam the prophetess. Now, this is where she's given the name prophetess. And this is the first mention of any prophetess in the Bible. And actually, even though Moses was a prophet, doesn't have that title. This is like the first. Now, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, none of these people were given the title prophetess or prophet, but she was actually the first that actually had the title. And that means just that they speak for God. It says Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a hand drum in her hand, tambourine probably, and all the women went out after her with hand drums and with dance. Miriam sang in response to them, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. And then again, we read that she's mentioned in Micah. Now, if that was the end of her story, we could be all applauding and saying, oh, how wonderful she was. But she had a fall. And we're just bringing it up because we're talking about her life. When Miriam married an Ethiopian woman, it says that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite or the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman, and they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not even spoken through us as well? Now, it says right before that Moses was the most humble, the meekest man there was on the earth. There was no man more humble than Moses. And that's her brother. That's her little brother. And she thought she had a right to say, you know what? You're supposed to marry a Hebrew woman, not a woman. Maybe I don't know who this woman is. She's never mentioned again. But she corrected him, and she became his authority. Even though she was his older sister, she was under his male authority. He was the leader of the people of Israel. He was God's chosen authority at that time. So after she said that, I just think of him being the most humble man. What made Moses the most humble man? It wasn't something, humility isn't something like, oh, she has humility in her and she doesn't, like it's something they received from God. Humility is knowing who you are in the sight of God. And Moses knew that he was nothing and that God was everything. He knew he didn't want any honor for himself. Even though he was leading an army of 500,000 people, and God spoke to him and did all these miracles through him, yet he knew It had nothing to do with him, that God was just using him. But Miriam spoke up with pride. God has spoken through me. I'm the leader of the women. And it said because of that, the anger of the Lord burned against her. And she ended up with leprosy. And because of that, everything stopped. You think of these 500,000 people, everyone stopped in their tracks. Now, there's reason to believe, if you look at the original language here, that why was Miriam punished with leprosy and Aaron wasn't? Anyone remember why? Well, if you look at the original language, when it says that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, Miriam's mentioned first. And also, that spoken against in the original language, it's a feminine a verb, feminine singular verb. It's not like they spoke against Moses. It was Miriam spoke against Moses and Aaron went along with her. That's what happened. And Aaron immediately repented and asked Moses to pray for Miriam. And he did. And God closed her out of the camp for 7 days, that she would be separated. And then she would be allowed back in. And I was thinking when I read this that when we sin, it just doesn't affect us. You may feel like, well, who's it hurting but me? But look at she said something wrong against the authorities that existed, which was Moses, and the whole camp had to stop. Everyone there had to like freeze until she was restored. And God, in his grace, did restore her. And then when she spoke it of again, well, the next time she spoke it of was when she died. And that she was buried in the wilderness. Neither Aaron, Moses, or Miriam made it to the promised land. So that's the story of Miriam. But the purpose of it is to say how much authority she had. She was a prophetess, but she was under the authority of a man. God spoke to her, and she was a leader of the children of Israel. And what's interesting about her, unlike a lot of the other women mentioned in the Bible, she was single. She never married. And that's very unusual. First of all, it was unusual for any woman not to marry, because that was just the order of things. But there's never mention of her having a husband or children or anything. But she was a woman of great authority under the authority of her baby brother. And so we have to be very careful that we don't use the influences we have as women in our families to influence somebody just with our own personal influence instead of the Holy Spirit of God. Okay? Now, the next person in our book is Deborah. And Deborah's just like the most amazing Old Testament woman, because she appears in Judges chapter 4. It says on page 78, just a little story of her. The next prophetess mentioned in the Bible is Deborah. In Judges 4:4, she is described. Now, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She was both a political and spiritual leader of the people of Israel. Under God, there was no authority higher than hers. Can you imagine, in the whole land, she was the highest authority. Actually, in many ways, her position was higher than many of the coming kings of Israel. During the era of the kings were not sovereign, but operated under the words of the prophets. And we've talked about this in the past. God spoke to the prophets, and the prophets told the king what to do. And I think that was like such wisdom, because there's such corruption in power. So the king he wasn't sovereign. Now, it says here that the prophet stood between the king and God. The good kings of Israel listened to the words of the prophets, and the evil kings did not obey them. Having both the title of judge and prophetess, her authority superseded the rule of the kings that would follow her. So God gave this, she must have been absolutely amazing. And God gave her grace and wisdom to fulfill this role. Now, it is important to note that she was the wife of Lapidoth. This is not just a casual mention because all the words in the Bible have purpose. Deborah held the titles of prophetess, wife, and judge. And we see that in four of Judges. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. So we have her there with three titles: prophetess, wife, and judge. This tells us that she was under the authoritative covering of her husband. There's no reason to believe that Deborah wasn't a good and submissive wife. Numbers 30 clearly states that the authority that the husband has over his wife. And this was written, Numbers was already, the law was already written when Deborah became the judge. So she lived by the law, she judged by the law. When she made judgments to the people, it was not according to her own disposition or her own likings. It was because the law was written and she enforced the written law. So there's no reason to believe that she wasn't under the authority of her husband. Yet Deborah was a great and powerful woman, but she was under her husband's protective authority. In Judges 4, she exercises her authority over Israel and calling Barak to come to her to receive orders from God. Barak was a mighty warrior. He was the general of the Hebrew armies, and he did not bow to anyone except to God and to Deborah. I love the Old Testament warriors. These men were like men, you know what I mean? And I always think of them because Hebrew men didn't shave their beards and they had longer hair. And I see this lion in these warriors, and so many times they're like described as fiercest lions, but they probably look like it. They had a mane and a beard, and they weren't afraid of anyone. But she called for Barak to find out why he didn't go to war against the Canaanites as God had commanded. In this account, we see Deborah speaking bravely to a mighty man of God. She was a woman under authority with the authority of God. Barak replied to her question in Judges 4:8. Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, then I will go. If you do not go with me, I will not go." Barak had profound respect for her because he saw her power and her faith. Barak went to battle with Deborah at his side, and God gave them the victory. Deborah teaches us how important we are as helpers who come alongside of our husbands and the men in our lives to encourage them to fulfill the will of God. And she fulfilled that role. And it's interesting too, that battle, after the battle, she sang, her and Barak wrote a song, and she called herself a mother in Israel. And I thought, she didn't call herself a judge. She didn't call herself a prophetess, but she called herself a very feminine mother. Her identity was as a woman, a very strong and powerful woman, but she never left the fact that she was a mother to Israel. What's a mother do? She protects, she provides, she takes care of, she helps. And Deborah saw herself in that light. But I think you can't read her account and not be so aware of the fact that she was a woman of great power that was respected by men and women alike. And she legislated the law of God. Now, the next one we're going to look at is on page 90. Huldah. Most people don't even know she existed, huh? Because she's just a little line in the scriptures. So the next woman we find in the Old Testament, recognized as a prophetess, was Huldah in 2 Chronicles 34:22, where it states of Huldah that she was the prophetess. Look at the next words, the wife of Shalom. She was a woman of great authority under the covering of her husband Shalom. Now, she's the third mentioned here, prophetess in the Old Testament. There's not any other women with that title. But the note is here that these were all women under authority. Miriam was under the authority of her brother, Moses. Deborah and Huldah were under the authority of their husbands. And because they were under authority, they were much like the centurion that Jesus spoke with when he said to Jesus, would you heal my servant? And he says, I'll come, I'll heal him. He says, oh, you don't have to be there. Just say the word and my servant will be healed, because I am a man like you, under authority. So I say to my soldiers or whoever, go, and they go, and they come, and I say, come, and they come. This is what authority, being under authority, does. It gives you authority. And this centurion that Jesus met understood the fact that he was under the Roman authority. And he was submissive to that authority. And because of that, he had authority over his men. Now, Jesus said, I have found no greater faith in all of Israel, because he recognized that Jesus was under the authority of God the Father. And that's why Jesus had authority. He knew, that centurion knew who Jesus was. And I've told this story before, but one time, decades ago, we had 3 foster kids, and they each had probation officers, and they were so bad. They were just bad boys. The youngest was 13, the oldest was 18. And one day I came home, and they were physically fighting, and the lamps were shaking. I mean, these were big guys. The 13-year-old was bigger than me. And I walked in the room and I saw them. They could have killed me. And they were the type of boys that wouldn't hesitate to hurt somebody that got in their way. So I remember seeing them wrestling, and I said to God the Father, I am a woman under authority. So right now I need your authority. And then I said to the boys, stop right now. I said, you sit there, you sit there, and you sit there. And they stopped in their tracks in a heat of anger, because I don't know what they were fighting about, but they were angry. But they stopped in their tracks, and each one took a seat apart from each other in that room. And that's what authority is. When you're under authority, you have authority. Now, I know women that scream and scream and scream at their kids, and the kids don't listen. It's because they're not women under authority. I've seen in certain households dogs that were out of control. I remember one in particular. This girl could not get her dog to listen to her about anything. The dog ran the house, but she was not a woman under her husband's authority. So she had no authority over this puppy dog. And then another time, I know I repeat myself, but I remember this other time. I was on the phone talking to a woman. I never met her face to face, but she called a lot, and in the background, her son comes in the house, and says, "Get me something to eat. I'm going out later on. Can you give me some money? I need to do." And he's just yelling at her. And she said to me, "Can you believe that he talks to me like that?" And I really felt bad for her. I thought, oh my gosh, I wouldn't know what to do if a child of mine talked to me like that. A little while later in the conversation, her husband walks in the front door after work. And she says to her husband, "You're late. Where were you? I want to go here. You got to give me the car. Give me some money." And her attitude toward her husband was the exact attitude that her son expressed to her. She had no authority over her son because she was not a woman under authority. And I just think there's so much authority from God in a woman that's under authority. And I really think that's one of the reasons why the children of this generation we lived in are out of control, because their mothers aren't submissive to anyone, not God or anyone. So they're not women under authority, so that they don't have authority. Now let's go back to Huldah. Huldah lived during the reign of Josiah, king of Judah. I don't know if you know anything about Josiah, but he was a godly king. He was one of the few godly kings. And when he became king, the whole land seemed to turn. He listened to the prophets and the people listened to him. He was a man under authority, so he had authority over the people in the land. And the people in the land they were all idol worshippers at that time. Syria was already judged, and Babylon was going to come in pretty soon and judge Judah, because after his reign, the next kings were evil. But Huldah lived during the reign of Josiah, king of Judah. The kings that came before him were evil and propagated the worship of idols. Fortunately, King Josiah was a man of God, and he decided to rid the land of the high places where idols and false gods were worshipped. He also began to rebuild and clean the temple in order to restore true worship to the God of Israel. Okay, when Josiah ordered the cleaning of the temple, the workers came across a scroll, which was a copy of the word of God. When he read the scroll and realized how far they had strayed, the people in the land, from the law, he called for Huldah, because he knew she was a prophetess who spoke for God. And I just think her authority and who she was, her character was so renowned that it got from her. She actually was a garment keeper in the temple, but her reputation went to the throne. I just think of what an honorable woman this is, because there's a lot of people between the king and the workers in the temple. But he knew she was a prophetess who spoke for God. She informed him that Israel was going to be judged by God for their sins. Because of her words and humility to God, he repented. The king repented at her words. She was a woman under authority, and she had the authority of God on her side. Through her, God spoke to the king Josiah. These words are recorded in 2 Chronicles 34:27. Because your heart was tender, these are the words of God to Josiah. Because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before God when you heard his words against this place and against its inhabitants, and because you humbled yourself before me, tore your clothes and wept before me, I truly heard you. He actually humbled himself before, first of all, before Huldah, a woman prophetess, and he was honored by God. Josiah understands godly order. Huldah was a great woman of God under the authority of her husband. God used her to be his voice in speaking to the king who submitted to her words. Throughout the Old Testament, women who had power with God and men were under delegated authority. I hope you see that there's true authority, and then there's the kind of authority people try to have, like by being bossy or showing off or thinking they're higher and better in themselves than someone else. Like we talked about Moses being the humblest man on the earth because he knew in himself that he was nothing. And everything he had was a gift of God. He didn't even really want to be in the position he was in, even though he was the greatest of all Old Testament men. This stands true today. Women under authority have authority and are used mightily of God. Women who are not under authority do not have the authority of God. And next week, we're going to look at, this is kind of quick today, but next week we're going to look at the 3 New Testament. Actually, there's 5 New Testament women prophets who were all also, they weren't married, but none of them were, but they were under the male authority. So we're going to look at them next week. That's all we have for tonight. Okay.